The day they called you cold was the exact day you stopped obeying what was silently controlling you. There is a moment that almost nobody talks about. A strange turning point in life when the same people who once needed your warmth, your presence, your availability and your emotional generosity suddenly go quiet. Not because they changed, not because they reflected on what they had taken, but because something in you stopped radiating in their direction. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. When you begin separating yourself from environments that shaped your identity through pressure, expectation, and unspoken demands, the people who benefited from your warmth often misinterpret that separation as coldness instead of growth. In simple terms, when you stop giving your energy away, people who once depended on that energy will almost always name your withdrawal as a flaw. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. See, when people are used to having access to your warmth, your patience, your reactions, your explanations, your time, and even your emotional labor, your freedom doesn't look like freedom to them. It looks like cruelty. It looks like punishment. It looks like betrayal. Sometimes it even looks like madness. But here's the part nobody warns them about. Freedom has a very specific side effect. It makes you still in rooms where you used to perform warmth. It makes you quiet in conversations where you used to overextend. It makes you unavailable in places where you used to keep everyone else comfortable. And suddenly people start whispering what happened to them. Meanwhile, you're just sitting there, holding your peace like it's warm tea nobody else was invited to. And slowly, very slowly, realization begins to spread. You weren't cold. You weren't cruel. You weren't punishing anyone. You were stepping out of a version of yourself that only existed to warm other people at your own expense. And the moment they finally understood that, that was the moment everything between you and them changed forever. Number one, they needed you to look cold so they would never have to look guilty. There is a quiet strategy people use when they don't want the truth examined too closely. Instead of admitting what they took, they start explaining who you've become. Instead of addressing what they demanded, they start questioning why you stopped giving. It shifts the spotlight away from their behavior and places it directly on your temperature. And once that shift happens, everything you say starts sounding like bitterness instead of clarity. That is how the word cold gets introduced into situations where the real issue was never your personality. It was discomfort with their reflection. When someone benefits from you doubting your own warmth, your composure becomes a threat. So they start calling you distant. They say you changed. They say you became heartless. They say you stopped caring. Not because those things are true, but because once those labels stick, nobody has to investigate what they actually drained from you anymore. And here's the part most people don't realize at the time. The moment others start seeing you as cold, your credibility gets quietly reduced in the room without anyone saying it directly. It becomes easier for people to ignore what you endured because now they believe the problem is your temperature, not the situation itself. But something powerful happens when you step away from that environment and stop reacting inside their version of your story. Your voice becomes steadier, your decisions become clearer, your presence becomes deliberate. And suddenly the demeanor they used to call cold starts looking composed, intentional, and wise. That's when the realization begins to spread. You weren't freezing them out. You were responding to the chill they refused to name. You weren't becoming cruel. You were noticing patterns they hoped you would keep absorbing, and you definitely weren't heartless. You were refusing to keep generating warmth for people who had no intention of returning it. Once people see you standing steady outside their emotional climate, the old labels stop making sense, and when those labels stop working, the silence that follows usually tells the real story. Number two, they confused your quiet with cruelty until they saw you rebuild without their fire. When you stepped back, they thought you were punishing them. That's how people usually interpret stillness when they're used to being the center of your warmth. They assume quiet means revenge. They assume distance means punishment. They assume you will eventually return to your old self once the cold spell passes. What they didn't expect was that your stillness wasn't a weapon. It was a decision. At first they waited. They expected signs that you missed the old warmth. They expected messages, reconciliations, or small attempts to reach back. They believed time would pull you into the same pattern because that's what had always happened before. But something different was happening this time. Instead of reaching backward, you started rebuilding forward. And that's what confused them. They were watching you disappear from their view, but they weren't watching you disappear from your own life. You were reorganizing your priorities. You were protecting your energy. You were learning how to move without needing anyone else to confirm that your warmth was welcome. While they were waiting for your return, you were learning how to stand without their approval shaping every temperature in your life. The truth is, some people mistake access for affection. They think if they can't feel your warmth anymore, then nothing meaningful must still be happening inside you. So when they stopped hearing from you, they assumed your softness stopped too. They didn't realize that sometimes healing happens quietly, without witnesses, without announcements, and without permission. Then the evidence started showing up. Your choices became warmer in the right places. Your direction became clearer. Your confidence stopped sounding like negotiation and started sounding like calm. And suddenly they were forced to face something they hadn't prepared for. You weren't freezing in silence. You were thawing in private. That realization changes how people see you. Because once they understand that you rebuilt parts of your life without needing their presence to keep your temperature up, they can no longer believe the story that you depended on them to feel anything at all. Number 3, they thought you had frozen until they realized you had simply escaped their climate. People who are used to controlling or defining your life have a very specific atmosphere in their minds. It's a version of you that fits neatly into their expectations, routines, and assumptions. They know how warm you're supposed to be, how soft your voice should sound, and what your emotional responses should look like. The moment you step outside of that atmosphere, cold registers on their end. Even if on your end everything feels like spring. At first your freedom looks like freezing to them. They see a softness they didn't predict. They see a calm they can't manipulate and a rhythm they can't influence. From their perspective, it must mean you have gone numb. You're shutting down. You're hardening without reason. That's how they try to explain your independence in terms they can digest, by reframing it as emotional collapse. But the truth is far more unsettling. When you start making decisions based on your own inner climate instead of their expectations, you stop being a predictable element in their weather system. They expect certain emotional outcomes because they relied on patterns to justify their influence. When those patterns no longer hold, they feel exposed, like someone suddenly opened a window in a room they had kept closed for years. And here's the moment that hits hardest. While they were trying to figure out which way you had gone cold, you weren't frozen at all. You were designing an inner life that had nothing to do with the temperature they wanted you to maintain. Every step outside their atmosphere was intentional. Every boundary you set, every choice you made, every silence you held wasn't random. It was a deliberate escape from the version of yourself they wanted to regulate. Eventually, their perception shifts. The same composure they once labeled as frozen now reveals structure, purpose, and warmth in places that actually matter. The confusion they felt transforms into a slow, uncomfortable recognition. You were never numbing. You were untethering. You were moving in directions they could never chart. And when that dawns on them, it's both terrifying and humbling. The climate they relied on for understanding no longer applies, and the warmth they thought they owned is now entirely beyond their reach. Number 4, they called it coldness because they couldn't call it liberation. When you started stepping back, they gave your distance a name they could tolerate. They didn't say you were claiming space or protecting your peace. They didn't say you were asserting your freedom or reclaiming control over your emotional thermostat. Instead, they called it coldness. They framed your choice as something negative, something that required explanation, repair, or even apology. The word itself carries judgment. It implies a flaw, a punishment, a problem that needs fixing. But it was never any of those things. From their perspective, it was easier to assume that something had gone wrong with you than to admit that you had stopped being a tool for their emotional convenience. They were comfortable thinking of you as a permanent source of warmth in their lives. And when you started acting independently of that role, it broke the entire script. The label of coldness is a shield for their discomfort, a way to claim authority over your decisions without acknowledging that you were acting with clarity and grace. The reality is that your withdrawal wasn't about punishing them. It was about stepping into a version of life where their interference no longer mattered. You weren't shutting down. You were recalibrating. You weren't freezing them out. You were defending your fire. And when you carried on quietly, maintaining warmth in directions they could neither cross nor influence, the truth began to reveal itself. What they had dismissed as coldness was actually sovereignty. They called your calmness emptiness. They called your distance cruelty. They called your focus detachment. But every label they applied only highlighted one thing. They could no longer control the temperature. They could no longer insert themselves into your atmosphere with the same impact. Your peace didn't require their approval. Your decisions didn't require their validation. Your warmth didn't require their permission. And that is the moment they realized the real shift had already happened. You weren't cold. You were untouchable. You weren't distant. You were free. And once freedom appears in its full, undeniable form, it changes everything, leaving the people who once monitored your warmth scrambling to understand what they can't touch, regulate, or stop. Number 5, they thought you had stopped feeling because you stopped performing warmth for them. For a long time, people depended on you to play certain emotional parts in their lives. You were the comforter, the listener, the translator of moods, the one who absorbed tension so everyone else could function comfortably. Your warmth was not always valued for what it was, but for what it provided. Every smile, every reassurance, every adjustment became a service to maintain their emotional equilibrium, and they learned to rely on it without ever acknowledging the cost to you. The moment you stopped performing those roles, the room went quiet. They assumed something had gone wrong with you. They whispered that you had become cold, that you had lost your softness, that you had become overwhelmed. They couldn't see that you weren't shutting down at all. You were opening up to yourself. You stopped bending to meet the expectations that had long suffocated your warmth. You stopped fitting yourself into emotional boxes designed for someone else's convenience. What they didn't realize is that the roles they thought defined you were never your roles to begin with. They were scripts handed to you by habit, obligation, or silent coercion. And once you refused to perform them anymore, the first instinct of those who depended on you was panic. They expected ice because they couldn't imagine a world where you weren't warming their side of the room. But instead of ice, there was calm. Instead of collapse, there was clarity. You began to operate according to your own energy, your own priorities, your own standards. The real shock for them came when they noticed you thriving without their scripts. You weren't reacting frantically. You weren't seeking approval. You weren't over-explaining or overcompensating. You were simply existing and moving forward on your own terms. And suddenly the narrative they had spun about you becoming cold no longer fit. What they finally realized, usually too late to stop it, was that you weren't frozen. You weren't broken. And you weren't lost. You were reclaiming the very warmth they had long taken for granted. And that reclamation revealed a truth they could neither undo nor ignore. The person they thought they had warmed was always capable of generating their own heat. Number 6, they expected regret. Instead, they saw relief. For years, people conditioned to controlling your warmth assumed that any step away from them would eventually circle back to guilt or hesitation. They expected you to stumble, to second-guess yourself, to look back with longing or apology. That's how they justified their own influence. If they believed you would eventually regret stepping out, they could continue operating under the illusion that your emotional life still revolved around their approval. But what they didn't anticipate was the unexpected side effect of freedom. Relief. Real, undeniable relief. The kind that shows up when the pressure stops, the expectations dissolve, and you finally stop performing warmth for someone else's comfort. Relief isn't dramatic. It doesn't need an announcement. It just quietly settles in like a fire being relit in a room they didn't even know had gone dark. The first time they noticed it, they were confused. They watched you move forward without anxiety, without hesitation, without looking back. You weren't apologizing for stepping away. You weren't trying to smooth over the cracks in their comfort. You weren't replaying old scenarios in your mind. You were present, clear, and calm in a way that contradicted everything they expected from someone leaving their world. It was almost terrifying for them because relief isn't something they can control. They can't manufacture it, manipulate it, or weaponize it against you. They can only watch as it manifests, and in doing so they are forced to confront the truth. You weren't dependent on their warmth. You weren't lost. You weren't making mistakes they could exploit. And with that relief came something deeper: clarity. The calm that comes with independence is not fragile. It is a signal that your decisions are now guided by your own internal sun. Every choice you make, every boundary you maintain, every step you take is intentional. You no longer move in their orbit. And that quiet certainty is the hardest reality for them to accept. What they assumed would be regret became the opposite. Your distance didn't signify loss. It signified liberation. You weren't collapsing, doubting, or regretting. You were finally at peace, and that peace was a mirror they couldn't break, a truth they couldn't deny, and a warmth they could no longer control. Number 7. They mistook your boundaries for coldness until time proved they were permanent. Boundaries are invisible walls to some people, but they are lifelines to anyone reclaiming control over their own emotional climate. When you first started saying no, stepping back, or refusing to engage in the ways they were used to, they misread it. They labeled your distance as cruelty, frustration, or overreaction. Every line you drew was seen as a mood instead of a measure. Every refusal was interpreted as a threat instead of a declaration. From their perspective, you weren't setting limits. You were lashing out. At first, it may have seemed like your choices were temporary, like a phase. They believed that a little time, a little pressure, or some persuasion would bring you back to the old rhythm, the rhythm they were comfortable with. They assumed boundaries are fleeting because in their world, no one really steps outside the invisible rules without eventually coming back. But you weren't reacting. You were responding. You weren't expressing anger. You were enforcing clarity. You were drawing lines in a way that didn't need justification or dramatics. And that's what shook them the most. When weeks turned into months and the lines didn't shift, when your availability, energy, and attention no longer conformed to their expectations, the story they had created for you began to crumble. Time has a way of revealing the truth that words cannot. What they had been calling a mood was actually a methodical realignment of your life. What they assumed would fade under pressure became permanent. And slowly they had to acknowledge something deeply unsettling. You weren't upset, you weren't reacting, and you weren't in transition. You had simply stopped negotiating access to your warmth for people who had no right to it. The permanence of your boundaries forced them to face the truth they had been avoiding. You weren't a storm to weather. You were a presence they could no longer manipulate. What they assumed would be temporary emotion revealed itself as undeniable intention. And in that realization, they understood too late that your life was no longer theirs to influence. Number 8, they thought you needed permission to feel again, because they needed you frozen to stay the same. Some people can't fathom independence because they've spent their lives relying on approval to define their choices. In their world, change requires permission, validation, and consensus. They operate under the illusion that identity is something granted by others rather than claimed by oneself. So when you began shifting, evolving, and making decisions without asking them for consent, it triggered confusion, suspicion, and sometimes panic. They assumed you must be broken, reckless, or overreacting. They couldn't imagine that a person could simply step out of old expectations and start steering their own emotional weather. In their minds, transformation required consultation, and deviation from the established pattern was dangerous, alarming, or cold. What they were really seeing was not a lack of feeling. It was a refusal to hand over your warmth to their authority. While they were clinging to comfort, predictability, and the illusion of influence, you were learning a profound truth. Change doesn't require witnesses. Growth doesn't need a committee to approve it. Progress doesn't need anyone else to sanction it. And once you fully accepted that, your life started moving in ways they could no longer predict, influence, or interfere with. That's when the unease began. They watched as decisions were made without consultation, boundaries were enforced without explanation, and priorities were shifted without apology. Every action you took outside their orbit was proof of autonomy. Every moment you existed without asking for validation was a quiet declaration of independence. And slowly, painfully, they realized something uncomfortable. You didn't need them to sanction your evolution, but they desperately needed you to stay frozen in order to preserve their sense of control. Your freedom became a mirror reflecting their reliance on external approval, and it was impossible for them to ignore. The very structure they had built around you, expecting you to conform, comply, and circulate within their rules, was crumbling because you had discovered something they couldn't access: self-determination. They finally understood, often too late, that your change wasn't permission-seeking. It was permission-giving. You had become the author of your own warmth, and the rules they depended on to define you no longer applied. Number 9. They called you distant until silence removed their influence over your narrative. For a long time, people who thrived on controlling your story relied on your voice to validate their version of events. Every explanation, every defense, every justification you offered became a tool they could twist, interpret, and use to maintain the illusion that they were in charge. Your energy, your reactions, your attempts to clarify, they weren't neutral, they were ammunition. And so over time they labeled you cold, emotional, overreacting, or unstable because it served their purpose to frame your existence as frozen instead of intentional. But then you stopped participating. You stopped defending, explaining, and reacting. You stopped feeding the machinery that depended on your energy. The moment you withdrew, a strange thing happened. The narrative they had built around you began to fall apart. There was nothing left for them to manipulate. Your silence wasn't empty. It was precise. Every unspoken word was a refusal to supply the material their version of you needed to survive. Initially, they misread the quiet. They assumed you were confused, overwhelmed, or defeated. They expected chaos to erupt, expecting the old pattern to resume. But chaos never came. Instead, your calm persisted. Your presence remained measured. Your life moved forward on your terms. And slowly they had to reckon with the fact that what they thought was coldness was actually intention. Time revealed the truth they couldn't deny. Your silence wasn't absence. It was control reclaimed. By not participating, you had removed their ability to define you. Their influence over your story had vanished, leaving them exposed, powerless, and scrambling for an explanation. What they called cold had always been reactive to their pressure. But without the feedback loop, their labels lost meaning. The realization hits hard. You weren't performing for them. You weren't feeding the narrative they depended on. You had stepped outside their reach, outside their interpretation, and outside the version of yourself they believed they owned. And when that becomes undeniable, it's terrifying for them, because nothing they say or do can reinsert them into your story. You are no longer the character they wrote. You are the author. Number 10. They expected you to return to familiar ground because they never left it themselves. People who are used to having influence over your life often assume that any step you take away from them is temporary. They can't imagine permanent change because their own lives are stuck in repetition, defined by routines, expectations, and the constant need for validation. To them, stability means staying in the same emotional patterns. And anyone who departs from those patterns is just on a detour that will inevitably end where it began. They expect return because they themselves never learned how to leave. So when you started stepping back, making decisions without consulting them, and moving in directions that weren't pre-approved, they assumed it was a phase. They assumed that absence meant struggle. They assumed that sooner or later you would seek their warmth, guidance, or approval to reset yourself to the way things were. Their world is built on predictability. So when predictability fails, they feel threatened. But you weren't planning a return. You weren't searching for validation. You weren't trying to replicate what had been comfortable or safe. You were building a life outside of influence, reshaping your priorities and moving forward with clarity that they couldn't access. Every step you took reinforced a truth they weren't ready to accept. Your life no longer belonged to the map they had drawn, and that is what unsettled them the most. They watched from a distance, waiting for the familiar patterns to resume, only to see them replaced by something entirely new. Your calm replaced their expectation of chaos. Your clarity replaced their assumption of confusion. Your confidence replaced their hope for return. The realization that finally hits is brutal. You aren't coming back to the old ground because that ground was never yours to begin with. It was theirs. They were anchored to what they could control. And you discovered freedom in movement. By leaving the familiar behind, you revealed a truth they can't deny. Independence doesn't require their consent, approval, or presence. It only requires the courage to step beyond the orbit of expectation. And once you do, return becomes irrelevant. Number 11. They thought you were shutting down emotionally until they saw strategy in your composure. For a long time, people around you assumed your reactions were impulsive, emotional, or unpredictable. Every time you spoke up, pulled away, or set a boundary, they framed it as drama, overreaction, or instability. From their perspective, someone who moves outside the patterns they understand must be acting on impulse rather than intention. They believed that if they could just provoke, confuse, or pressure you enough, you would revert to the old patterns, proving that you were emotional rather than deliberate. What they didn't anticipate was that your withdrawal wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Every step back, every pause, every decision to disengage was intentional. You weren't reacting to annoyances or injustices blindly. You were observing, analyzing, and deciding which battles were worth your energy and which were not. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Your absence wasn't avoidance. It was positioning. Over time, as they continued to misinterpret your calm as weakness or confusion, the pattern became undeniable. They watched you maintain consistency in your choices, firmness in your boundaries, and clarity in your actions, all without the need to explain yourself. They expected unpredictability, but instead, they saw control. They expected emotional collapse, but instead, they saw direction. And slowly they were forced to confront a truth they hadn't prepared for. What they assumed was reaction was actually foresight, and what they labeled as drama was precision. The realization hit hardest when they noticed results emerging from your distance. Things that once caused chaos no longer touched you. Situations that demanded energy in the past now flowed around you, and you remained unshaken. Your actions weren't dictated by pressure. They were guided by intent. That's when everything shifts. They stop labeling, they stop predicting, they stop assuming. Your presence, your decisions, and your calm become undeniable proof that independence is strategic, not emotional. What they mistook for coldness all along was actually mastery. Mastery over your environment, your energy, and yourself. Number 12, they called you insensitive until you stopped regulating the temperature of everyone else's room. For years, people around you depended on your ability to feel, interpret, and manage more than your fair share of the emotional load. You were the translator of moods, the mediator of conflicts, the one who carried the weight that nobody else wanted to touch. And because you gave so much of yourself, they labeled it sensitivity, as if your awareness, empathy, and patience were weaknesses instead of strengths. They framed your openness as fragility, as though noticing their patterns or absorbing their tension made you vulnerable rather than powerful. But something shifts when you stop taking responsibility for everyone else's emotional climate. When you stop explaining, mediating, and fixing things that aren't yours to fix, the world changes around you. People who once relied on your warmth suddenly find themselves accountable for their own cold spots. And the very same people who called you sensitive because you felt too much now realize you weren't fragile at all. You were overloaded. You were doing more than was expected or sustainable. The moment you stop absorbing everything, your presence becomes different. Your calm is sharper. Your decisions are clearer. Your boundaries are unshakable. And that's when the truth hits them. They begin to see that your sensitivity was never a flaw. It was a sign of strength, awareness, and endurance that they mistook for weakness because they could not handle it themselves. They relied on you to soften their conflicts, explain their contradictions, and absorb their energy. And when that stopped, they were forced to confront the reality that they had been leaning on someone who refused to be used as a buffer anymore. The revelation is quietly devastating for them. You are no longer the emotional safety net they depended on. You no longer explain, justify, or carry their stress. You no longer bend yourself to make others comfortable, and in stepping back you reveal a hard truth they cannot ignore. You were never too cold. You were simply giving too much. And now, having chosen yourself over their expectations, they are forced to face the power of someone who finally stopped being everyone else's emotional thermostat. Number 13. They thought you would beg for their warmth until they realized you had already stopped asking. For years, People around you depended on your consent, your explanations, and your willingness to justify your choices. They thrived on the illusion that your life needed their validation to function. Every agreement, every clarification, every compromise reinforced the idea that you were reachable, moldable, and predictable. And for a long time they assumed that this pattern was unbreakable, that sooner or later you would return to seeking their approval, quietly bending yourself to fit their expectations once again. What they didn't anticipate was the moment you stopped asking entirely. You didn't negotiate, justify, or explain anymore. You didn't give them access to your energy or time simply to keep the peace. You stopped performing the role they were comfortable with and started living according to your own rules. And in doing so, you revealed something they had never prepared to see. You were no longer dependent on their permission. At first, it confused them. They interpreted your calm confidence as anger, withdrawal, or confusion. They expected desperation or hesitation, the subtle signals that would indicate you were still seeking their warmth. But the more you operated without their input, the more undeniable the truth became. You weren't angry, you weren't lost, you weren't collapsing under the weight of their judgment. You were free. The quiet strength of someone who no longer seeks approval is impossible to exaggerate. It's visible in decisions made without hesitation, in boundaries that cannot be crossed, and in a presence that no longer negotiates for acceptance. And slowly they realized that the power they thought they held over you was an illusion. The person they assumed would return to their orbit had already created an entirely new orbit of their own. When that dawns on them, it shifts everything. The manipulation stops working. The criticism falls flat. The expectation of compliance disappears. You are no longer performing for anyone but yourself. And in that realization, they see clearly for the first time that the person they thought they could shape has already stepped into independence. Your warmth is yours, and their approval is irrelevant. Number 14. They believed your freedom would freeze you until they realized it set you on fire. For a long time, people around you assumed freedom was something fragile, something to be feared, negotiated, or softened with compromise. They expected that stepping away from old patterns, old roles, and old dependencies would leave you vulnerable, exposed, or unsure. In their minds, independence was a precarious state that required constant reassurance, support, or even correction. They framed freedom as a risk, assuming that the moment it arrived you would falter, stumble, or return to the familiar safety of their orbit. What they didn't anticipate was that freedom didn't weaken you. It amplified you. Every choice made without interference, every boundary enforced without apology, every step taken outside the orbit of expectation became a demonstration of your growing power. The silence they had hoped would signal confusion or numbness instead became a signal of control. Your presence, once interpreted as pliable or reactive, now radiated intentionality and self-mastery. They watched expecting panic, hesitation, or compromise and found none. They expected you to crave their guidance or approval, and instead you moved with clarity and certainty they could neither predict nor influence. Each decision reinforced a truth they couldn't deny. Independence isn't the absence of influence, it's the presence of authority over your own life. Slowly the realization hit. Their influence, manipulation, and attempts to control no longer applied. The power they thought resided in their ability to shape your actions was revealed as nothing more than a reflection of the energy you once allowed them to borrow. Freedom, once feared by them, as fragility had become your strongest asset. And in that moment, everything shifts. They can no longer dictate your pace, your choices, or your focus. Your life is no longer negotiable. Your path is no longer theirs to interpret or influence. What they assumed would freeze you, destabilize you, or force a return, instead lit something in you they could no longer reach. Freedom was never something to fear. It was the fire they could never take, and the power you now wield with precision and resolve. The moment they finally understood you weren't cold, heartless, or unreachable, that you were free, everything changed. Every label they ever tried to place on you, every expectation they relied on, every assumption that you needed them to define your warmth, crumbled in the face of your clarity, your calm, and your unshakable presence. You weren't reacting to them. You weren't performing for them. You weren't seeking approval, validation, or permission. You were living entirely on your own terms, and in that independence, you became untouchable. They watched as silence replaced explanations, boundaries replaced overextension, and warmth replaced obligation. What they had called sensitivity became strength. What they had called drama became strategy. And what they had labeled coldness became intention. You didn't just step away from control, you dismantled it. And the quiet, almost invisible shift in your energy revealed the truth they had long refused to see. You were no longer theirs to influence, manipulate, or predict. This isn't just freedom, it's transformation. It's the kind of liberation that forces people who once relied on your presence, your energy, and your compliance to finally confront reality. You moved beyond expectation, beyond judgment, beyond influence. And in doing so, you claimed a power that is rare, undeniable, and entirely yours. Your life now moves on your terms, and that truth is the most powerful statement you could ever make. So remember this: warmth is not something you owe. It is not something to perform. And it is not something to prove. It is the natural result of a soul that has stopped being regulated by people who had no right to its thermostat. Those who once misread your silence, questioned your choices, or relied on your compliance are now forced to witness a reality they cannot control. You are warm, you are steady, and you are untouchable. If this message resonated with you, and you want more content that empowers, inspires, and reveals the truth about reclaiming your life, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Every action supports this movement of clarity and freedom, and together we continue to rise beyond expectation. Stay blessed, chosen.